As I crossed into Ontario, the rain let up at last, but the day remained chilly, and I finally sought refuge at the Northern Leats Motel in Cochrane. 850 kilometers was plenty for that kind of day. Pouring a measure of the Macallan from my little flask into a plastic cup, I felt its warmth inside as I hung my wet riding gear around the room. In the shower I thought about Cochrane, isolated at the northern edge of Ontario's grid, and ghosts came out of the memory of a concert that Rush had played, back there in the mid-70s. After driving all night from Winnipeg, we had played our set to a spattering of applause, and at the end we left the stage figuring that was that. However, when we got to the dressing room, the promoter, a squat and hairy French-Canadian, descriptively named Hunk, came running in, distressed we hadn't played an encore. He said the agent promised him we would. We protested that an encore was usually a request for another song from the audience, and that there had been no response that night to indicate any such desire. Hunk became more distraught, saying in his thick accent, "I never thought Rush would do this to me." The three of us looked at each other, shrugged, and went back on stage. The audience was waiting quietly, we played another song, and everyone went home. No one seemed excited, but everyone seemed satisfied. We knew that everyone in town knew how much we were getting paid, probably $1,000, and that the agent had promised Hunk an encore. After the gear was packed and loaded up onto the truck, 7 of us from the band and crew piled into a rented station wagon and drove all night back to Toronto. All that seemed so far away and long ago, part of another life. Even after my first terrible loss, I had felt no urge to work with the band anymore, and the day of Selena's funeral I had told my partners in Rush, Getty and Alex, all of us in tears, that they should consider me retired. I hadn't worried about whether or not I could afford to work again, it simply was unthinkable. After 23 years together, Getty and Alex were loyal and caring friends through my sequence of nightmares, and they were, of course, nothing but supportive and understanding of whatever I wanted to do. Now that I was trying to carry the weight of yet another unbearable tragedy, I had even less reason to care about the future. Or even if I had a future. Certainly I had no interest in playing the drums or writing lyrics for rock songs. Before that night, when my world crashed down around me, I had been working on a book about my motorcycle adventures with my friend Brutus on the just-finished Rush tour for Test for Echo. Now I couldn't even imagine taking up that project again. That night in Cochrane, I took refuge in my journal notes once more as I sat in the Northern Leats dining room after my fried pickerel. Usually the tastiest of freshwater fish, but not this specimen. The only other diners were a pair of retired couples, and I heard them marveling to discover they hailed from 2 Ontario towns, Brantford and Peterborough. That they were all of a 2-hour drive apart. One of the ladies even moved to remark, "It's a small world." One of the men also tried to be sociable to the solitary diner, and leaned towards me to say, "You're being awful quiet over there." Startled, a dozen possible replies zipped through my answer index, all of them true, but some of them real conversation enders. In the end, I gave a shy chuckle, nodded towards my dinner, and said, "Oh, I'm okay." Later I wrote in my journal, "Perils of Solitude number 1. People talk to you. I'd rather listen." The next morning I continued west across Ontario on the road from dawn until late afternoon, pausing only for fuel, and an occasional pause at the roadside for a stretch and a cigarette. Just kept moving, afraid to stop for too long, afraid to give myself time to think. Riding a motorcycle with total concentration, devoting infinite attention to the ever-changing road and other traffic. That was sufficient to keep most of my little brain busy. My mind was also lulled into tranquility by the motion, the trance-like effect of steady vibration, occasional bumps and curves, and the world coming at me mile after mile, hour after hour. Earlier that summer, contemplating the wreckage of my life, I had determined that my mission now was to protect a certain essence inside me, a sputtering life force, a meager spirit, as though I had cut my hands around a guttering candle. In letters, I had begun calling that remnant spark my little baby soul, and the task before me now, I decided, was to nurture that spirit as well as I could. My little baby soul was not a happy infant, of course, with much to complain about, but as every parent learns, a restless baby often calms down if you take it for a ride. I had learned my squalling spirit could be soothed the same way, by motion, and so I had decided to set off on this journey into the unknown. Take my little baby soul for a ride. When I arrived in Quebec from Toronto, after everything else was gone, I didn't have much interest in the world around me. I didn't like anything, didn't care about anything, and didn't want to do anything. The first hint of a possible upturn came one afternoon when I was sitting on the dock with a glass of the Macallan in one hand and a cigarette in the other. Way down at the far end of the shining lake, near one of the islands, my eyes fastened on 2 wedge-shaped rocks sticking out of the water. Those 2 rocks had always reminded me of a pair of ducks facing each other, and that day, my little baby soul decided to imbue them with meaning. A voice spoke inside my head. "You know, I still like those 2 rocks." My eyebrows lifted at the realization. I actually liked something, and thus from that pair of rocks I began to build a new world. It would have to be a world my little baby soul could stand to live in, and a world that included the possibility of all that had happened. So it was going to be very different from the world I had lived in before. However, I was starting with first principles, the Earth, and now I was traveling westward, and I began to respond to the landscapes around me too. The rugged cliffs and forests around Lake Nipigon and the north shore of Lake Superior. If I wasn't exactly finding joy in that scenic splendor the way I used to, I was at least resonating again, feeling the beauty around me and curious about what that next line on the map might look like. As I rode toward that line on the map, my serenity, my thoughts, and my internal music were suddenly interrupted by the ugliest of sounds. Even through earplugs, helmet, and wind noise, there was no mistaking that loud electronic whooping and bleeding, and my eyes darted to the rearview mirror, which was filled with the insistent flash of red and blue lights behind the grille of a local police cruiser. Cursing, I pulled to the side of the road and straddled the bike. The officer walked up beside me, held out his hand, and said, "May I have your radar detector, please?" Flustered, I protested. "But it's supposed to be undetectable." He shook his head. "They shouldn't be allowed to get away with saying that. Someone should go after them. I knew it was an undetectable one because it gave off a weird signal." Damn it. Then worse. As he looked over my Ontario's driver's license, I saw his head give a little jerk upward, then move in closer. He peered into my helmet, smiling now. "You a musician?" I mentally rifled through the answer index again, looking for a truthful evasion, not an easy task when you're answering a man with a uniform and a gun. Eventually I mumbled, not anymore. He paused a moment, looking over my insurance and registration. "You used to be a musician, though." Many years ago." He went on talking about some place in Toronto where he used to live that was apparently close by, that was supposed to be meaningful to the person he thought I was, but I was still thinking of alternatives from the answer index. I used to be a lot of things. Lately, I had written to one of my friends, "I don't know who I am, what I'm doing, or what I'm supposed to do. Time would tell, I could only hope, and if time was supposed to be the great healer, then the best thing I could do was try to let it pass as painlessly as possible. Try to minimize the self-destructive urges and stay away from the house on the lake for a while. Let time pass, take my little baby soul for a ride." The policeman finished writing out my ticket, and I went riding on.